Morning, everyone. This hearing of the Senate Budget Committee will come to order. We will be discussing this morning an issue of concern to all Americans, namely housing. Secure and affordable housing is a building block of financial well-being. Being able to afford a home provides not just shelter, but community and stability. When families cannot afford housing, they face increased barriers to education and employment. They have worse physical and mental health outcomes, and they likely face generational poverty. Unfortunately, families across America are paying the price for a housing market failure that was years in the making. Nationwide, the U.S. faces a shortage of 4 to 7 million housing units available for sale or rent, which, of course, drives up cost. Barriers to getting a mortgage are making it harder for first-time buyers to purchase a home. With fewer people able to purchase homes, demand in rental markets has soared, creating a shortage of available rental units, driving up costs. Helping families afford a safe, stable place to call home should be neither controversial nor partisan. And I will take a moment to recognize Ranking Member Grassley for his work in past years to do bipartisan housing work. And I thank him and congratulate him for that from the Finance Committee chair. Key to addressing the shortage of units and bringing down costs for families is, as my friend Speaker Shekarchi from Rhode Island would say, production, production, production. When Speaker Shekarchi took the gavel in 2021, he promised to become the housing speaker, a promise he has more than kept. In just 3 years, he has shepherded over 30 bills into law to tackle Rhode Island's housing shortage. Coupled with historic budget investments, his legislation has addressed long-lagging housing production, expanded the state's housing supply, and blunted upward pressure on rents and home purchase prices. Nationally, there is evidence we are turning the corner in communities across the country. New construction is way up, home prices are coming down, and the Fed is finally cutting interest rates, as many of us have repeatedly urged them to do, and that makes mortgages more affordable. Construction of multifamily housing developments increased 22% in 2023, the highest annual increase in more than 3 decades. The pace of single-family home building climbed steadily throughout 2023 and has stayed elevated. Vacancy rates in professionally managed apartments rose to nearly 6% this year, more than twice the record low of 2.5% set in early 2022, which in turn stabilizes the rental market. This is thanks in large part to important steps Congress and the Biden-Harris administration have taken to increase the housing supply, to protect renters, and to ease cost burdens. More than $18 billion of the American Rescue Plan's state and local fiscal recovery funds have gone towards expanding housing supply, investing in homeless services, and providing nearly 4 million additional households with rent, mortgage, and utility relief. Senate appropriators, Chairman Murray present, continue to support housing programs like the Home Investment Partnerships, Community Development Block Grants, and Housing Choice Vouchers. Last week, the Congressional Budget Office released a report on long-term projections for new housing starts, finding that the housing shortage will persist unless policymakers take decisive action. Yesterday, I introduced new legislation to significantly expand our nation's supply of affordable housing by bolstering the low-income housing tax credit. The Affordable Housing Construction Act would more than triple states' funding for affordable housing under the program, loosen financing requirements, and extend the period during which housing must stay affordable. With Congressman Panetta and Blumenauer, I've also introduced a $15,000 first-time home buyers tax credit for lower-income Americans, refundable, advanceable, and available for home buyers at the time of purchase to help make homeownership a reality for more families. And I thank Vice President Harris for her pledge of a $25,000 similar credit. Other proposals to make housing more affordable include Senator Wyden's DASH Act, Senator Van Hollen's Bipartisan Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act, the Fair Housing Improvement Act, led by Senators Kaine and Sanders, the Deposit Act, led by Senators Lujan and Padilla, and Senator Padilla's Housing for All Act. We have a busy budget committee on this subject. Vice President Harris also called for the construction of 3 million new housing units through a historic expansion of the low-income housing tax credit. Today's witnesses will hopefully point the way towards creative solutions to our nation's housing shortage. One thing we know for certain is that inaction is not an option. As I turn to our ranking member, Senator Grassley, let me welcome Senator Reid, who has joined us. When it comes time for witness introductions, he will be helping with the introduction of our very dear friend, Speaker Shekarchi. And I want to thank the committee for allowing Jack to participate in that. He'll be staying through the Speaker's testimony, I understand. Chuck, over to you.
I appreciate it's an issue that is central for Iowans and all Americans, something they care about deeply. It's very central to what both Republicans and Democrats call the American dream. Over the past 4 years, Americans saw how home prices and particularly rents skyrocket as inflation ran rampant, thanks to the policies of this administration. Thanks to Bidenflation, prices throughout the economy are up 20% since the start of the administration. Even worse, housing prices have skyrocketed nearly 40% and are currently at an all-time high according to Case-Shiller Home Price Index. Inflation has thankfully eased over the past years, largely due to action taken by the Fed, but that shouldn't be used as an excuse to once again open up spending spigot, risking further inflation. Unfortunately, that's exactly what some of the proposals out there do, and I refer particularly to Vice President Harris touting the advocacy of hundreds of billions of dollars in demand-inducing housing subsidies. Economists from across the political spectrum have noted how such policies would backfire by pushing up housing prices even further. We have Ed Pinto, who I've invited to testify, will tell us. He's going to quantify exactly how Vice President Harris's policies will make housing less affordable. In addition to calling for more subsidies, the Vice President has also touted plans to implement a version of rent control. Rent control policies have been disastrous at the state and local levels, and it would be a huge mistake to adopt them at the federal level. And that's not just this senator's point of view. We have Jason Furman, who served in President Obama's chief economist, panned Harris's proposal, saying, quote, "Rent control has been about as disgraced as any economic policy in the toolkit. The idea that we would be reviving and expanding it will ultimately make our housing supply problems worse, not better," end of quote. Before we add new housing programs or expand existing ones, we should have a good look at how the ones we already have. Currently, there are more than 100 federal housing programs. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the federal government will spend over $750 billion over the next 10 years in housing assistance alone, and that doesn't include billions in additional housing programs and federal loan subsidies for mortgages that are provided by government agencies, which would include at least the Department of Agriculture, Defense, and Veterans Affairs. On top of that, the tax code includes incentives for home ownership and the construction of low-income housing. And the chairman has referred to my efforts in that category. Instead of adding to the list of federal housing programs, Congress should focus on increasing the effectiveness of existing policies by eliminating duplication and complexity. That's why at this committee's previous hearing, I invited Bill Slover to testify. Mr. Slover provided a firsthand account of waste and inefficiency presently in our housing programs. Moreover, he highlighted the lack of accountability in the state housing agencies. Mr. Slover's testimony was consistent with what I've discovered as part of my oversight work. For decades, I've conducted oversight of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and local housing agencies. And during that investigation, we were able to expose rampant waste, fraud, and abuse. Too often, government overpays for poorly executed policies, and the maze of housing programs create inefficiencies. And what I just said about my investigations applied to both Republican and Democrat administrations, not properly supervising from the federal level the oversight that they should have on these, because I found that HUD does very little, if any, oversight of housing authorities, so they get away with lavish office spending on salaries, vehicles, parties, and travel. Meanwhile, those less fortunate wait in line sometimes for years for actual housing assistance. So we should be focusing on forcing HUD to do its job, but the majority isn't doing that while HUD fritters away tons of taxpayers' money. I also welcome Jack Salmon, who will refocus the debate on this committee's fiscal policies with debts, deficit, and interest expenses. I'm sure the administration is counting on the Fed's recent interest rate cut to lower housing costs. However, interest rates are but one of a host of factors driving housing costs. Moreover, lower interest rates may be fleeting if we don't do our job to rein in unprecedented debt and deficits. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Speaker Shekarchi and I came into politics together as young staffers for Governor Bruce Sunderland, a crucible experience that forged lasting friendships. So I'm personally thrilled to have him here today. Senator Reid, the senior senator in our delegation, will introduce him, but as he does, let me point out that Jack has a position on the Appropriations Subcommittee on Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development, and he is also the senior Democrat on the Banking Committee, which has authority over housing, and his work on housing has earned him, I think, every housing award that housing organizations give around here, some of them twice. So he knows whereof he speaks, and over to you, Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Whitehouse, and thank you for very kind words. I'm proud to join you today to welcome and introduce the committee's first witness, Rhode Island Speaker of the House, Joe Shekarchi. When I first met Joe over 30 years ago, he was a fresh-faced lawyer at the very beginning of his career, but his intelligence and extreme competence were evident even then. Across the past 3 decades, Joe has become a respected member of the Rhode Island Bar and a dedicated servant to his hometown of Warwick, Rhode Island. In 2012, Joe was elected to the Rhode Island State House of Representatives, and in 2021, his colleagues selected him to be their speaker. Joe's accomplishments as Speaker are numerous, passing tax cuts for small businesses and families, enacting an historic pay equity law, and bringing thousands of new jobs to Rhode Island. But nowhere has his work been more impactful or important than his efforts on housing. Indeed, when Joe became Speaker, he quickly focused on the significant housing shortage that was making housing unaffordable in Rhode Island. He understood that for over a decade, we have been underbuilding in Rhode Island. In fact, we're last in the country. With far too few homes available, the costs were far in excess of what the family or any family could afford. Joe tackled Rhode Island's crisis head-on. In less than 4 years as Speaker, working collaboratively with state leaders and various stakeholders, he has guided nearly 50 housing bills into law. These include our state's first ever dedicated annual funding stream for affordable housing, creating a new cabinet-level position for a Secretary of Housing, and new investments totaling hundreds of millions of dollars in housing supply and assistance. Each of these successes, on their own, would have been one of the state's most important housing accomplishments in recent memory. Collectively, they are a giant leap toward ensuring every Rhode Island family can afford a safe, comfortable home. I'm glad we have Joe leading the charge for creating housing affordability in Rhode Island, and I'm very glad that Chairman Whitehouse invited him to be here today to share his deep insights and experience on housing policy with us and our colleagues. And once again, thank you, Senator Whitehouse, not only for your kind invitation, but for your great leadership. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Senator Reid. Our second witness is Mr. Paul Williams, the founder and executive director of the Center for Public Enterprise, an organization focused on broadening public sector economic development capacity, particularly in housing. His organization provides technical assistance and guidance to state housing finance agencies across the country. Welcome, Mr. Williams. And our next witness will be introduced by our esteemed colleague from Virginia, Senator Tim Kaine, whose timing is near perfect. Senator Kaine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Ranking Member Grassley, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here. I am very honored to introduce a longtime friend and neighbor and admirable Richmonder and Virginian, Greta Harris. Greta is the president and CEO of the Better Housing Coalition, and she's the pride of Danville, Virginia, and then after getting a degree in architecture at Virginia Tech and then graduate studies in architecture and urban planning at Columbia, has become a passionate and successful advocate for affordable housing for a very long time. She served as vice president of an organization called the Local Initiative Support Corporation, which is a national nonprofit that works in community and economic development. She led local offices in both southern and Midwestern regions. And then she began her tenure as the CEO and president of the Better Housing Coalition in 2013. Greta's impact on the BHC and affordable housing in the Richmond region has been absolutely remarkable, and her leadership has positioned the BHC to realize the same success in 5 years as it had over the previous 30 years combined. BHC is the largest nonprofit development corporation in Richmond, and they create high-quality homes for low and moderate-income residents, empowering them to reach their fullest potential. Many of these homes are created in neighborhoods that I used to represent back in my time as a city council person, and I've seen firsthand the tangible impact that Greta has had. The organization's portfolio includes an array of multifamily rental communities, rental units, single-family homes. Its services support 1,100 residents a year, and I'm proud to have secured funding for 2 of HBC's upcoming affordable multifamily projects through the congressionally directed spending process. I acknowledge the head of the Appropriations Committee as I comment upon that. That's been really great work. For over 2 decades, Greta has been a true champion of affordable and accessible housing. She has won every award that anybody in Richmond gives. She's on numerous boards and has been a true success. So I'm super happy that Greta is able to be here today. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Senator Kaine. I'll now turn to my distinguished ranking member to introduce his witnesses.
Mr. Ed Pinto, a senior fellow and co-director of the Housing Center at the American Enterprise Institute. A focus of his work continues to be the role of federal housing policy and how it continues to create unwelcome distortions in the housing market. More recently, his research has focused on using light touch density to increase the supply of naturally affordable and inclusionary housing. Before joining AEI, Mr. Pinto was the Executive Vice President and Chief Credit Officer for Fannie Mae until the late 1980s. Our final witness, Mr. Jack Salmon, Director of Public Policy of the Philanthropy Roundtable. His work focuses on research, commentary, and analysis of issues facing charitable sector and philanthropic freedom. Prior to joining the Roundtable, Mr. Salmon served as program manager and researcher at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where he oversaw policy relating to budgets, taxation, institution, and economic policy. We welcome both of you.
And with that, Mr. Speaker, you are recognized for 5 minutes, and your full statement will be made a part of the committee record.
Good morning, and thank you, Senate Budget Committee Chair Senator Whitehouse, for inviting me to speak before you today. And thank you, Senator Reid, for the kind introduction. Thank you also to Ranking Member Senator Grassley, as well as all the distinguished Senate Budget Committee members. I appreciate all of you taking the time to consider this critical issue housing. My name is Joseph Shekarchi, and I'm the Speaker of the Rhode Island House of Representatives, and I'm passionate about housing. Serving the legislature of a small state is very hands-on. You become deeply aware of the wide variety of complex problems that your constituents face. You eventually realize that many of the solutions to these problems are tightly interwoven and interconnected. During my time in the legislature, I've recognized a fundamental truth. Housing is the core issue. In fact, the housing crisis complicates almost all other challenges facing our communities. If we don't solve the housing crisis, how can we improve our educational outcomes or shore up the job market? How can we ensure a proper healthcare workforce, grow our economy, or lift our families out of poverty? Very simply, we can do all the policy programming we want, but if a child doesn't have a safe place to sleep at night, what does it all mean? When I became Speaker in 2021, I pledged to make housing my top priority. Let me quickly paint Rhode Island housing picture for you. Rhode Island is the smallest state in the nation, but we are very densely populated, with just over 1 million residents living in about 1,500 square miles of land. We have some of the oldest housing stock in the country, and for too many years, Rhode Island has ranked dead last in the nation for new housing starts. The price of a single-family home in Rhode Island has nearly doubled in 5 years. In 2019, the median home price in Rhode Island was about $250,000. This year, the median price is $494,000. These factors have created a perfect storm, bringing us to where we are now, in the midst of a severe housing shortage. It took many years to get where we are, and I am acutely aware of the scale and duration of effort required to get to a remedy. Rhode Island is not standing still. I'm passionate about housing, and I've made it my top legislative priority. Over the last 4 years, working with my colleagues in state government, we've passed almost 50 new housing laws. As a foundation to our legislative work, we've created 2 year-round study commissions comprised of legislators, housing advocates, planners, builders, and other stakeholders. The work of these commissions have shaped much of our legislation. We're listening to the experts, following the data, and making real, sustained progress. I'm incredibly proud that each of the 4 comprehensive packages of housing legislation that we've passed in Rhode Island have enjoyed strong bipartisan support. In terms of our legislative housing policy, my mantra has been production, production, and more production. The legislation we've passed has focused on reducing barriers to development, eliminating red tape and redundancy. With the goal of increasing housing production, we have created the first ever permanent revenue stream for housing development of affordable housing. We've created and committed funding to a new cabinet-level position of Secretary of Housing, as well as a new Department of Housing to coordinate our focus and our efforts. We created a dedicated court calendar for housing appeals. Developers complained that many communities were using the appeals process as a stalling mechanism. For developers, time is money. Cases were being delayed indefinitely, sometimes for years. Reducing the backlog of pending appeals has already had a significant impact. We're not changing the rules for development. We're making the process clearer, more consistent, and more streamlined. We've also looking to a new and innovative solutions. We've passed legislation making it easier for homeowners to develop accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, also known as in-law apartments. ADUs are a great option for seniors wishing to age in place, for recent graduates looking for cost-effective housing, and for the disabled to live independently but in proximity to family members. ADUs offer gentle density by adding housing units to existing blueprints without changing the character of a neighborhood. Rhode Island's legislation allows ADUs by right when meeting certain requirements, eliminating zoning approval and saving additional cost. I'm incredibly proud of this legislation, which was a top priority of AARP nationally. Like ADUs, manufactured housing is also another option with lesser lead time and lower cost. Rhode Island passed legislation to expand land available for siting of manufactured homes. I'm also intrigued and curious about the Montgomery County, Maryland model for public housing. We've invited Maryland officials to present before our commissions, and we're working to determine how that model could work here. Additionally, we have proposed $10 million for a pilot program. Rhode Island has enacted the first-time home buyer program, which has funded using state fiscal recovery funds and including assistance for down payment. It has been a huge success, resulting in participation of 1,672 home buyers in Rhode Island, 46% of whom are minorities and 47% are whom female-headed households. Housing issues are not unique to Rhode Island. At a recent national governors meeting, every single state listed housing as a top issue. And HUD estimates that the national shortage of housing units is more than 6 million homes. There are many misunderstandings about what affordable housing is and what it looks like. Housing is considered affordable when it costs no more than 30% of an individual's family gross income. When housing prices soar, people at the lower end of the economic spectrum are disproportionately impacted. The reality today is that working families are priced out of the housing market, not just for home ownership, but also for renting. In Rhode Island, a household earning our state's median income of $74,000 would not be able to buy an affordable house in any of our cities and towns. These families include our teachers, nurses, firefighters, healthcare aides. These workers are the backbone of our community, and they should be able to afford to live in the communities they serve. I respectfully request that Congress provide states with greater funding mechanisms and grant opportunities to develop more housing to foster public-private partnerships. I would like to see further expansion of financial assistance for renters like rental vouchers, as well as a down payment support for first-time home buyers. Senator Whitehouse's proposed legislation, the Affordable Housing Construction Act of 2024, would leverage federal tax credits to encourage investment in housing. Rhode Island's small size makes us the ideal partner for the federal government on housing issues. We are a nimble state. We have shown that we can quickly move on housing legislation. I come before you because we are ready in Rhode Island to act on this offer. We could become an incubator to pilot innovative, creative housing programs with the federal government. As long as I'm in the office of Speaker of the House, I pledge that affordable housing will continue to be a core mission for me. I will bring my unshakable passion for the development of a modern policy that ensures every Rhode Island has reliable access and a safe place to live. I sincerely thank you for your time and consideration, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your many successes and for being here today. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. As you know, housing affordability is critical for American families. Housing expenses are far and away the largest single item in most American households' budgets, taking up 20%, 30%, or as high as 50% or more in severe cases of a family's household income. Ensuring that housing costs remain stable and affordable helps those families by giving them more flexibility to invest in other necessities and also to save for the future. But housing affordability doesn't just help families. It also helps businesses thrive in the economy. When families have more income to spare, they can support more small businesses in their communities. And when more families can afford to live in a neighborhood, businesses have an easier time growing. To promote housing affordability across the country, consensus among policymakers, economists, developers, and advocates is clear. We need more housing supply. Bringing new housing supply online requires addressing zoning and land use issues, streamlining permitting, and easing financing constraints. My message to the committee is that the federal government should help bring more stability to the housing investment cycle. Today, a lack of liquidity in the construction financing market has led to hundreds of thousands of would-be homes sitting on the shelf unbuilt. Let me begin by sharing with you a key statistic from the Census Construction Survey. From 2000 to 2020, there was an annual average of about 50,000 multifamily homes that were authorized or permitted but never started construction, as you can see in the chart to my right. Over the past several years, that figure has dramatically increased, reaching a peak of 165,000 in early 2023, about 3 times more than the prior 2-decade average. Today, that figure still sits at about 131,000, more than double the prior average. In other words, there are hundreds of thousands of homes that have received their permits to build, but they haven't started building. What's going on here? construction financing. My organization, Center for Public Enterprise, works closely with public agencies across the country, including many of our state housing finance agencies. This summer, we described this issue in a report, which I've included as an addendum with my testimony, and provided several strategies for addressing it, including by enabling federal instrumentalities to provide counter-cyclical support to construction financing. That is, a tool that can be active in difficult financing environments and scale back when financing becomes more forthcoming in the market. A key issue in the way of more housing supply, in addition to zoning and permitting issues, is a lack of liquidity in housing construction finance. To give a pointed local example, in Massachusetts today, there are more than 40,000 multifamily homes that have been permitted or authorized but are stalled due to financing constraints. The permits are in place, the housing demand is there, rental vacancy rates are below 4%, but the financing challenge remains. At some points in the business cycle, when loan-to-cost ratios are higher and products like mezzanine financing are more readily available, this issue is not so predominant. But at other points in the business cycle, countercyclical tools are crucial to ensuring that these viable projects can move through the pipeline, create good jobs, and create high-quality homes for American families. One of the difficulties that a cyclical investment cycle creates for housing affordability is a difficult trap that hampers our ability to provide supply that matches demand over the long run. For many commodities like eggs or N95 masks, a spike in consumer demand leads to producers making quick investments in new supply that can become available in a matter of weeks or months. Multifamily housing, on the other hand, takes not months, but years to come online. From the time a housing demand spike begins to the time keys are in families' hands, often 2 or 3 years may have passed. In economic parlance, the supply response of housing, particularly multifamily housing, is significantly lagged relative to the demand events. This dynamic magnifies the already existing boom and bust shape of a business cycle. If we're going to create the level of housing supply needed in the market to meet housing demand, we will need support of tools that can provide some smoothing to this investment cycle by providing construction financing liquidity throughout that cycle. There are many ways to structure this support. In fact, many of our nation's housing finance agencies have begun to implement small but scalable local solutions to this problem. Montgomery County, Maryland's Housing Opportunities Commission has a tool called the Housing Production Fund. Massachusetts recently created a tool called the Momentum Fund, and municipalities in Georgia and Tennessee, in partnership with our organization, have recently created local investment vehicles to provide similar support for multifamily development. To build on this local innovation across the country, policymakers could look to federal agencies that can support smoothing the housing investment cycle. The GSEs have a history of exploring construction financing tools and could be authorized to create a new product that supports this type of financing in times of low liquidity, but pulls back in times when financing is more readily available. And Congress could explore options for supporting construction financing, such as through those GSEs, and with support such as through a letter to the Federal Housing Finance Agency on this topic. The success of these innovative local models is clear. Imagine the boom in construction that could occur if such a tool were available nationwide. Such a tool could create stability not just for housing investment, but also for many things that depend on housing investment: good construction jobs, healthy housing supply, housing affordability for American families, and a stronger economy for everyone. Thank you for your time and your consideration. I'm more than happy to follow up in greater detail with you and your staff should you be interested in exploring these topics further, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Harris, welcome. The floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Grassley, members of the committee, and other distinguished guests, thank you for the opportunity to address an issue that touches the core of our economy and the well-being of millions of Americans: affordable housing. My name is Greta J. Harris, and I lead the Better Housing Coalition, a NeighborWorks chartered organization, and Central Virginia's largest affordable housing developer. We are honored to provide service-enriched, quality rental housing for nearly 3,000 lower-income individuals and seniors while offering opportunities for homeownership. Over the last 3.5 decades, we've invested $300 million into our community, with another $300 million in our pipeline, ensuring that more of our neighbors have a good place to call home. America stands at a critical juncture. The lack of affordable housing is not just a challenge for lower-income families. It's a systemic issue affecting nearly every facet of our society and economy. And the consequences of inaction ripple far beyond the housing market. As housing costs outpace wages, today more than 10 million Americans spend over half of their income on housing, leaving little for essentials like food, health care, and education. This suppresses consumer demand and hampers economic growth. Businesses in both urban and rural areas struggle to attract and retain talent because workers can't afford to live nearby, thereby stifling business expansion, innovation, and productivity. The societal costs of unstable housing are also severe. Studies show that housing instability is linked to worse health outcomes, increased mental health issues, and lower learning achievement for children. Families forced to move frequently disrupt their children's education, which has long-term consequences for their development and future economic mobility success. Moreover, the brunt of the crisis falls hardest on vulnerable populations, communities of color, single parents, veterans, and the elderly. For communities of color, this crisis deepens the racial wealth gap, perpetuating cycles of poverty. And homelessness, a growing manifestation of the housing crisis, comes at a steep social and economic cost. A study from 2019 found that homelessness costs taxpayers upwards of $35,000 per person per year, while providing permanent, supportive, affordable housing costs significantly less as a more humane solution. Affordable housing is also tied to environmental challenges. Housing shortages often push modest-income families to the outskirts of cities, leading to urban sprawl, increased traffic, and higher greenhouse gas emissions. Addressing this crisis is not only an economic imperative, but also an environmental one. The core truth is that affordable housing is a public good. It strengthens communities, supports families, empowers our economy by contributing 16% to the U.S. GDP. When we invest in affordable housing, we create jobs, spur local economies, and provide families with the stability they need to thrive. At the Better Housing Coalition, we've seen lives transform when families gain access to stable, quality, affordable homes. Households can begin to breathe and then believe that their future can be better than their present. Individuals further their education, secure better jobs, and even sometimes transition to homeownership, creating a cycle of positive economic and social outcomes. The longer we wait to address this housing crisis, the more costly it will become. The question is not whether we can afford to act, but whether we can afford not to. We need a scalable, multi-pronged approach to this crisis, including investing in low-income housing tax credits, homeownership tax credits, community development financial institutions, expanding federal housing vouchers, funding housing trust funds, and strengthening intermediaries like NeighborWorks America, Housing Partnership Network, and LISC that build nonprofit capacity to serve lower-income households across the country. We must also support local zoning reforms to remove barriers to building affordable homes and reduce NIMBY, not in my backyard, opposition. We have many of the tools to address this housing crisis, but we need the political will to use them. As you deliberate on future federal budgets, I really urge you to prioritize affordable housing, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because our economy and our society depend on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My eyes are failing me. Mr. Pinto?
Yes,
Over to you. Thanks.
thank you. Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and committee members, thank you for the opportunity to testify on this most important topic. First of all, allow me to thank Senator Kane, along with Senator Warner and Senator Van Hollen for your support of the Low-Income First-Time Homebuyers Act, Lift Home. The Lift Home is a concept I developed in 2015, and it uses 20-year loans to build wealth rather than relying on 30-year loans, which would only increase demand. So history offers a cautionary tale against inappropriate federal action in the housing market. From the 1930s to 2008, Congress passed and presidents signed into law at least 43 urban renewal, housing, and community development programs. Despite each program's lofty promises, these initiatives consistently failed in making housing more affordable, and a number were downright disasters. The root cause for housing affordability is a shortage of 3 to 8 million housing units, which is fueling both unaffordability and a homeless crisis in many areas. Nationally, we have had a seller's housing market since 2012, and we remain in a strong seller's market today, especially at the low price end. Seller's markets provide upward price pressure, which worsens if demand is further stimulated. So I'll start with what not to do. Vice President Harris's plan to provide $25,000 in down payment assistance to 4 million first-time buyers over 4 years is almost certain to lead to higher home prices, thereby more than eliminating the intended benefits. Millions of program recipients would become price setters in their neighborhood for all the buyers in those neighborhoods, other first-time buyers and repeat buyers. Our research shows that home prices in those neighborhoods that are affected would rise by 3.6 percentage points, that 77% of all home purchases made in the United States would be subject to this home buyer tax, and this tax would total $175 billion over 4 years, more than the $100 billion cost of the program. This would be a wealth transfer to existing homeowners and really rewarding NIMBY opposition to added supply. Vice President Harris's proposal calls for the construction of 3 million new housing units over 4 years. History shows that this approach can lead to significant market distortions. The Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968 provided easy credit terms and substantial subsidies, resulting in a 2.5 million unit surge in housing starts by 1973. Only this boom dissipated by 1975 and left lasting scars on cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland that they're still trying to recover from. Similarly, the 1992 congressional GSE affordable housing goals, combined with President Clinton's national homeownership strategy, led to an easing of credit in the run-up to the great financial crisis. Housing starts increased by 3.7 million from 1992 to 2006, but then collapsed by 2009, leaving behind millions of foreclosures. We still have a persistent housing supply shortage dating to that crisis. Without massive credit easing, the Harris proposal would only incent new construction that would have been built mostly in any event, and any incremental construction would be unevenly distributed, causing even more supply-demand imbalances. Most housing today gets built in the southern region of the United States, which includes the South and Southwest. That accounts for about 60% of all new construction. That's where a lot of this new construction would go because it's roughly shovel-ready. Harris's $40 billion fund for local governments to explore innovative housing solutions will also funnel money into projects burdened by self-defeating government-mandated affordability requirement, which HUD loves, but markets abhor. The fundamental problem holding back housing construction, has been mentioned here, is not insufficient subsidies, but structural issues, restrictive zoning, land use rules, and building codes. This makes buildable land scarce and expensive and increases construction costs. We need to increase that market rate housing supply. The federal government has several levers it could use. First, a 10-year plan to auction surplus federal lands for new market rate home construction could add 200,000 homes per year. However, for this to be effective, the rules need to follow the keep it short and simple, or KISS rule. And it also could generate about $10 billion in revenue annually to the federal coffers. Eliminating the mortgage interest reduction for second homes would add to supply by turning second homes into primary residences and reduce demand, freeing up these 700,000 homes over 10 years. Reducing regulatory costs that hold back builders is also crucial. Adopting a credible plan to reduce deficit spending could lower the 10-year Treasury and mortgage rates by 75 to 100 basis points. Lastly, establishing accountability and expenditures for federal housing subsidy dollars, as Ranking Member Grassley said, is critically important. In 1953, the NAHB home builders said public housing is not low-cost housing, it's high-cost housing offered for low rent. We currently have a revolving door of projects that go through subsidy, rehabbing, tearing down, and rebuilding. These measures in combination with state and local efforts to deregulate land use and zoning can more effectively address housing affordability, all at no taxpayer cost and without unintended consequences. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion of the hearing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pinto. Mr. Salmon.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Jack Salmon, and I'm the Director of Policy Research at the Philanthropy Roundtable. Philanthropy Roundtable is a mission-driven organization which believes that a strong private sector, supported by a free enterprise system, is the bedrock for the creation of private wealth that makes philanthropy possible. In my remarks today, I'll talk about the bigger picture, considering our nation's fiscal condition and why worsening this condition through yet more spending would be harmful to the long-term well-being of all Americans. I will also highlight the fact that the often overlooked charitable sector is rising to the challenge of addressing homelessness and housing affordability. Proposals from the Harris campaign include plans such as a $25,000 down payment for first-time home buyers, which would add $224 billion in new deficit spending. Attempts to address housing affordability by further subsidizing demand will be counterproductive and make housing affordability worse. But more than this, such policies ignore the broader economic challenges we face, particularly the nation's deteriorating fiscal situation. The nation's fiscal situation has never been worse. Debt held by the public is now more than $28 trillion, while total public debt outstanding is over $35 trillion. If economic growth is slower or interest rates are higher than baseline models currently forecast, then public debt could reach 217% of GDP in the coming 30 years. As our debt burden has continued to grow unabated, rising interest rates have spiked the cost of servicing this debt. This means that policymakers have less fiscal space to commit spending towards their policy priorities. More than public spending crowd out, a higher public debt burden diminishes the economic growth potential of our broader economy. This should be especially concerning for those who care most about Americans at the lower end of the income distribution. Lower rates of economic growth mean less revenue potential for governments to support those who need it most, but it also means less job creation, lower wage growth, and diminished living standards. Another way in which our spiraling debt burden diminishes living standards is through inducing spikes in inflation. In recent years, we've experienced the largest spike in inflation in 4 decades. Prices today are 20% higher than they were at the start of 2021, while the cost of shelter is 23% higher. An academic article published last year found that the American Rescue Plan fiscal stimulus was primarily responsible for the spike in inflation we've witnessed in recent years. The authors noted that due to unfunded spending, it may take until 2025 for inflation to retrench back to 2% target. As economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas have pointed out in research published last year, high inflation disproportionately hurts low-income households the most. Proposals by policymakers to further induce demand will only worsen the cost of living crisis that American families are already dealing with. But it's not all doom and gloom. While most people know someone who has been impacted by either the homeless crisis or who struggle to find affordable housing, charities around the country have been doing inspiring work alleviating homelessness by addressing the underlying causes such as mental health, unemployment, and addiction recovery. Take, for example, Texas-based organization Mobile Loaves and Fishes, which helps the homeless by providing meals, housing, and income opportunities to help those in crisis get back on their feet. Residents in the Community First Village have an opportunity to earn income via different on-site programs instead of getting stuck in the never-ending cycle of poverty and homelessness. Another example is Step Denver, a Colorado-based organization that works men through a Steps for Success program, which helps them end the cycle of addiction and become productive members of society. The program appears to be working. 82% of alumni are currently employed, and 89% live in stable housing. The program has done so well that they have plans to expand to Colorado Springs, Phoenix, Albuquerque, and other cities in the future. Finding a solution isn't simply about providing affordable housing. It's about adequately addressing what created the problem in the first place. Private philanthropy is already rising to the challenge of alleviating homelessness and affordable housing crises, but their work is undermined when government pursues anti-growth policies. Rather than subsidizing demand through increased government spending and redistribution, policymakers should focus on policies that induce economic growth, not more government debt. Thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Very well. As I have said before, I think there's a strategy for dealing with the spiraling government debt. Number one is avoiding shocks to the economy. A third of the debt is from shocks to the economy. So avoiding the carbon bubble, avoiding property values crash from climate risk cascading into insurance markets, into mortgage markets would be job one. Reforming healthcare so that we're no longer the most expensive healthcare system per capita while providing mediocre life expectancy results would be another. Tax code reform, so we're not sluicing so much money out the back door of the tax code to the already rich and powerful, and budget committee reform, so we're focusing on that. So let me just make that clear. I'm also going to give up my time to Chairman Murray of the Appropriations Committee, who has important business elsewhere, and I'll swap with her. So the order will be Murray, Grassley, White House, and then on.
I'm going to swap with Johnson. He's got to go.
All right, Murray, Johnson, White House, Grassley. We got it.
Thank you. Thank
Chairman
you.
Murray.
Thank you so much for your commendation. The housing crisis is hitting everyone. I'm from Washington State. I hear about it all the time. We've got a long way to go, a lot of people to help, but to me, the bottom line is more affordable housing. In Washington State, we face a shortage of almost 172,000 affordable homes, meaning that for every 10 extremely low-income Washington State families, there's only 3 affordable homes. So I really believe this is an all-hands-on-deck crisis that requires every level of government to step up and do their part. On the Senate Appropriations Committee, I was really proud to help create the Pathways to Removing Obstacles to Housing program, or the